First, let's talk about what happened yesterday. You are now in DC in a hotel room, it looks like.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I would have left the greatest state in the union to come to Washington, DC is because I and my colleagues feel that our very democracy is at stake and that the freedom to vote for millions of Texans is in danger. And so we have left the state to break quorum and kill the voter suppression bill at the Texas Capitol and plead with our federal counterparts, our leaders in Congress and the White House, to pass the For the People Act that can safeguard our democracy and restore voting rights for millions of Texans and Americans across the country.
I think that second part that you mentioned is important because I think a lot of people may not realize that aspect of it. They just think that House Democrats left, and you're getting some people who are proud of that move and some people who are really criticizing that move. So what do you say to the people who are saying you left your constituents in the dust?
I am doing the job I was elected to do. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution. I took an oath to protect our democracy and the American experiment. And that's exactly what we're doing on this trip to DC. This was not an easy decision. So many of my colleagues are leaving behind children, leaving behind elderly parents, leaving behind sick loved ones. One of our colleagues has a wedding that they may miss, their own wedding. And so there are sacrifices being made, but those sacrifices are nothing compared to the sacrifices that brave Americans have made throughout our history to protect the sacred right to vote. We felt we were given no other option. We showed up to the special session last week. We met our Republican counterparts at the negotiating table to see if we could make this bill less dangerous, less toxic, and less harmful. And all of those suggestions that we brought forward to our Republican colleagues were rejected. And they jammed through this bill in the middle of the night at the last minute and gave us no other option but to break quorum to protect this precious democracy of ours.
And for those who may not know, they may not stay up to date with politics and who are watching this interview later on, what bill are you talking about?
So there are two bills, SB 1, Senate Bill 1, and House Bill 3. Both are the latest versions of the famous Senate Bill 7 from the regular session. And this is the bill that will make it harder to vote in Texas, a state where it's already really hard to vote, one of the hardest places to vote in the entire country. And we're going to make it harder for certain types of people to vote in the state of Texas, particularly people of color, young people, folks with disabilities. And the goal, the only goal, is to appease Donald Trump and his big lie that the election was stolen in 2020. Our Republican appointed Secretary of State in Texas said that the 2020 election in Texas was smooth, safe, and secure. I agree with our Republican Secretary of State. And I think that Greg Abbott and his Republican counterparts in the legislature have given up on democracy and have pledged their allegiance to one person only, and that's Donald Trump.
Well, let's talk about Governor Greg Abbott. We had him on KVUE last night, and he says that you all will be arrested and cabined in the Texas Capitol. What's your response to that?
You know, in my tweet announcing this quorum break, I ended it with two words: good trouble. And those are from the late, great John Lewis, a civil rights icon and an American hero who faced arrest and was arrested many times. Obviously, our struggle is nothing compared to John Lewis or the leaders of the civil rights movement, but we as elected officials have an obligation to honor that legacy, even if it means getting arrested, even if it means risking our livelihoods and our careers, even if it means leaving our families for weeks and months at a time. This democracy of ours, this opportunity to debate ideas freely and fairly in the public square is too important to let slip through the cracks because of someone's political agenda or because of Greg Abbott's presidential ambitions. This fight is too important. And so I frankly don't care what happens to me. I know many of my colleagues feel the exact same way because we feel like we're doing the right thing for our state, for our communities, and for our constituents.
I saw your tweet last night that said special session is over. Governor Greg Abbott says he's going to continue to call these special sessions until election next year. What do you have to say for that?
You know, that's why we're here in Washington, D.C., because we need our federal leaders from the White House to the Senate to the Congress to act now and pass the For the People Act, pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, to restore voting rights across the country and to stop voter suppression bills like the one trying to be passed in Texas from becoming state law. Our democracy is being unraveled in state capitals across the country because of Donald Trump's big lie. And it is up to our leaders in Washington, D.C. to step up for our democracy at the national level and prevent these harmful and dangerous bills from becoming law. So we are living on borrowed time because, as you mentioned, the governor seems to be infatuated with voter suppression and will do everything he can to strip voting rights from millions of Texans. And so if Congress does not act, this bill will become law. We are living on borrowed time and we need Congress to act now.
So without federal help, you believe that either SB 1 or HB 3 is going to make it to the governor's desk, and he's made it clear he'll sign it?
Absolutely. I think Greg Abbott and his Republican allies will do anything to please Donald Trump and to appease his big lie. They have shown that over and over again. They will do literally anything for Donald Trump's endorsement, even if that means selling our democracy up the river and forgetting their commitment to American ideals. And so I pray every night that my Republican colleagues will come to the same conclusion that we have to come together as Democrats, Republicans, and Independents to protect the American experiment. But barring that, I fear this bill will become law unless Congress acts.
Last week, both House, which you were a part of, and Senate Dems held press conferences, both saying all options were on the table to stop SB 1 and HB 3 from becoming a law. You guys obviously took a most extreme option, but one that another representative said was one of the only tools you all had. Do you all expect the Senate Dems to do the same thing?
I know some Senate Democrats have already joined us in Washington, D.C. I don't know what the Senate Democrats are planning or what their strategy is. There's enough to plan here on the House side, but I do know that our Senate Democratic colleagues stand in solidarity with us and with people who love democracy all across the country.
How many of the House Dems are in D.C. or heading to D.C.?
I don't have an updated number. I believe the number was 55 last night, but I think it's grown. I know a few members have joined us this morning. So it's certainly well above the threshold we need to break quorum. We have a united Democratic caucus. And as you know, it's hard to keep Democrats in line and united on anything. But the fact that we are all standing together opposing this anti-democratic effort by our governor should tell you something about how dangerous this bill is. And as you know, as Texas Democrats, we are used to losing on the House floor. Can you hear me?
Now I can. The last thing I heard was, as Democrats, you guys were used to losing on the House floor, which minority party in Texas.
Right. As Texas Democrats, we are used to losing on the House floor. We fight the good fight. We take a vote. We lose. We put on our big boy and girl pants, and we get back to it the next day to fight the good fight, and most likely lose again. We can disagree about abortion. We can disagree about immigration. We can disagree about guns. But what we can't disagree about is democracy itself. The reason this is different from every other fight, every other issue, every other vote is because Republicans are trying to rig the rules of the game itself. We can debate issues. We will not debate democracy itself.
We heard Senate Dems last week say they're going to fight a bill with a bill. You guys are fighting a bill with leaving and now trying to get the federal government involved as well. Talk about the specifics, aside from breaking quorum, what you're doing up there in DC working with the federal government.
You know, what we want to see is our federal government take action that's taken throughout American history to prevent voter suppression from happening in states like Texas. Unfortunately, state governments are often led by leaders like Greg Abbott, who will abuse their power and who will attempt to consolidate their authority and their political standing for their own gain, even if it means sacrificing our democratic ideals. And in that situation, as we've faced throughout American history, the federal government has an obligation to step in, to intervene, and protect the freedom to vote for millions of Americans and millions of Texans. That's all we're asking them to do. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act would reinstitute pre-clearance, which means that the federal government, in particular the Justice Department, would have the authority to approve any changes to election laws in places like Texas. That's the kind of common sense policy we need to reinstitute. I wish it wasn't necessary. I wish leaders like Greg Abbott and Donald Trump weren't trying to undermine the democratic experiment in this country, but that's the facts that we're facing. And so we've got to be clear-eyed about that. And we've got to do everything we can to protect the sacred right to vote, because without it, this democratic experiment of ours can quickly unravel.
So are you all prepared to stay there? As Governor Abbott says, he'll keep calling special session after special session.
If I could pan this camera, you would see the giant bag of packed. So I'm willing to stay out as long as I need to protect the freedom to vote for millions of my fellow Texans.
And then my last question for you, because I know you've got to get going. Again, I want to go back to the criticism that that you all are facing right now. They're saying you guys have private jets going to DC, that you're doing this on the taxpayer's dime. Respond to that, because some people do feel like their reps are gone and they're not representing them like they're supposed to, and working on other things like property taxes, et cetera.
So two things. One is everything that we're using for our travel expenses is being paid for by us, by our Democratic caucus, which means we are raising money as we speak. Thousands of Texans and Americans have already donated small amounts of money, $5, $10, $15, to help pay for our travel expenses to make sure that we could break quorum and kill this voter suppression bill. The second is anyone who has seen the governor's agenda for this special session knows that we're not dealing with issues that impact our constituents. Instead, we're chasing conspiracy theories about non-existent voter fraud, about critical race theory, about trans athletes. We're not fixing the grid. We're not expanding healthcare. We're not funding our public schools. If we were doing all of that, I think my Democratic colleagues and I would enthusiastically join with our Republican counterparts in the state capitol to make the lives of Texans better, but we're not. Governor Abbott has limited the agenda of this special session for far-right, red meat, Republican primary issues that have no relevance to most normal Texans. And so I reject that premise that we are not doing our job. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution, and that's exactly what I'm doing here in our national capital.
Anything else you want to add or you want people to hear?
I don't think so, and I appreciate you covering this.
Thank you so much for your time this morning.